Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Real Time Immigration. I'm really happy to be joined today for a special conversation with a gentleman named Mark Koumans, who's with me here today. Mark is currently the senior advisor at the Chertoff Group, but he had a very, very long and diverse career in the United States government up until very recently when he partially retired. He worked at the State Department in various roles. He worked at the Department of Homeland Security in various agencies, and he was gracious enough to lend me some of his time today to talk about those experiences and lend his insight into what's happening in the immigration space today in 2026. So, Mark, with that, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today. I'm really grateful to have you here.
Thanks, Finn. I really appreciate your invitation. Appreciate some of the work you've been doing with Lawfully, and look forward to the conversation today.
We joked before we started recording that I couldn't really do your career justice at all by just like reading off the many titles that you have, and nor could you do it justice by giving the short couple minute recap of everything you did in your career. But let's start there. Maybe just tell the story of sort of your
Okay.
initial roles in government and some of the roles that you held throughout your career through your retirement recently.
Thanks, Finn. So started as a Foreign Service officer in 1991, and as everyone did at that time, and maybe even today, a lot of consular work, visas in a number of posts in Europe and in Asia, and then came back, a number of tours in DC. Um, did some traveling, did some TDYs to various places around the world, and then closed out my Foreign Service career in Berlin in 2007, and uh, migrated from there over to Homeland Security. Did a lot of work with Homeland Security in the years 2004 to 7 when I was in Berlin. I got to know Secretary Chertoff, who visited, they hosted the World Cup, they had the G8 at the time, and this was just a couple of years after 9/11, which of course was traced back to the Hamburg cell of Muhammad Atta. And so a lot of bilateral cooperation with Germany, and Secretary Chertoff asked me to expand that, and he offered me a position that it was hard to refuse, and so I became his deputy assistant secretary for international affairs at Homeland Security headquarters, and was there at headquarters at that role and a number of other roles for a half a dozen years or so, and then it was Kevin McAleen, who was then a deputy commissioner and commissioner of CBP, asked me to come to CBP. Ended up spending about a decade at CBP, on and off, uh, half a dozen years, and then I went, a chunk of years, and then I went to USCIS, also a job that he had encouraged me to consider, and was the deputy first of Francis Cisno, who was then director of USCIS at USCIS during Trump 1. I was his deputy. Then it was a deputy to Ken Cuccinelli, who was named director, and stayed there until I was asked to handle the transition, which uh, heading into before the pandemic, it looked like they thought they were looking pretty good for a second term, but um, then the pandemic hit and realities changed, and there was a transition. Biden, although leading that transition uh, during a pandemic and during a cyber attack, the SolarWinds cyber attack, and also of course the assault on the Capitol on January 6th. That was a handful to handle that transition. And I know you wanted to talk about that a little bit more later, but then from there went back to CBP and handled a lot of the they call the office operations support, and that's what I did these last 4 years until I retired in May. That's an operations support handles all of the medical, all of the law enforcement, safety and compliance issues, the armory for CBP, which is the largest law enforcement agency in the country with 65,000 people. Our 24-hour nerve center, the International Affairs Office, laboratories and scientific services. So a lot of the unique technical and the areas of expertise and specialty that support the CBP agents and officers in the field. So,
Yeah.
and then retired in May on my own. I decided that after 4.5 years, or 4+ years in that position, it was ready. It was ready to do something new. And after more than 30 years working for the federal government, I was eligible. So happy to be eligible and happy to spend a little bit more time with the family and do some of my own projects and consulting.
Yeah, and I've said it before to some of the other folks who retired this past year from the federal government as well. Like you had long careers, that us on the sort of private practice side or market side are very lucky to have you now out of government because we get to learn from you. And there's a lot to learn. You had a lot of diverse positions over a long period of time across like different eras. I think not just in politics and American government, but in the how the immigration system in the U.S. has manifested itself. And at two of probably the two most important agencies or departments, obviously, for immigration policy, which is the State Department and DHS. And one thing I wanted to ask you is just like at a high level, how from the inside those two agencies, those two departments, or those two departments and their sub agencies interact on immigration policy in practice, right? Because we know on paper, everyone knows the visa bulletin, right? State and USCIS have to coordinate on the visa bulletin, which is super crucial to millions of immigrants who are waiting for their opportunity to be eligible for a green card in the United States. But there's so many more moving parts to that, and you were really at the head of that in a few different positions. So I'm curious to ask you how that overall coordination looked, and in particular, let's maybe focus on the last 8 or 9 years of Trump, the first Trump administration, the Biden administration, and I know you left sort of at the very early part of the second Trump administration, but that as well, right? These recent administrations, how does that coordination look?
Thank you. Good question, and it's one that has been I think, got a lot more press and public attention in recent years than it did earlier. Um, and I consider myself lucky, having worked at state as well as CBP and USCIS. And so I can't tell you how many conversations I've been in when people say, well, that other agency, they get it all wrong. And I said, well, having worked there, let me tell you how they come at this. So, it's consider myself fortunate. So let's actually look, if you look back before 8 or 9 years ago, that is what I would call sort of the more regular era.
Mm,
And among other things, what I was in charge of when I was working at Homeland Security was I was in charge of the visa waiver program. And we expanded it, as you may recall. A lot of countries from Eastern Europe, we let them in, and then Taiwan came in. How do you do that? Because of course Taiwan is not a country, and but they have their own passports. And how do you handle that? So with respect to immigration law, we have that carve out for them. But we allow Chile in, not your traditional European country. And so the White House led meetings. Senior director led a meeting. State is there. CBP is there. USCIS is there. DHS headquarters is there. How do we manage this? What are the concerns we have with respect to these countries? What are the immigration concerns, the border concerns, security concerns? And also, FBI is there. The intelligence community is there. How do we leverage the visa waiver program to make this, to get all the economic benefits, but as the statute says, also not increasing any vulnerabilities for us from an immigration point of view, border security point of view, intelligence, law enforcement point of view, et cetera. And that was orderly, and it was organized, and the White House, the White House always leads the coordination, but it wasn't the kind of, it was front page news in Taiwan, let me tell you, when they came in, but generally speaking, the things that were handled on a routine basis. But then, if you remember Obama with the Obama administration with DACA. So DACA came in, and that was, I think, for some, that became a first large program that was seen through a political lens. And from there, you take it to the first Trump administration, and the coordination there. Now, instead of what were regularly called IPCs, Interagency Policy Committee meetings, now you had the meetings that were chaired by Stephen Miller. As far as I'm concerned, I think he still chairs them now. So instead of the old days of a formal agenda, minutes that were circulated, very sort of old-fashioned bureaucratic, weekly, monthly cadence, who were the attendees, circulating those minutes. Now it's a little bit more informal. The agenda might be very brief. It would just say update from state, update from USCIS. And so it was a less is more approach. Things would be maybe a little bit more fluid, and minutes were not circulated afterwards, and
Mm.
it was kept a little closer hold. What was discussed in those meetings, you handled things on the phone because there might be FOIA requests, there might be things that were discussed in an informal basis that they didn't want to have the whole world or even a whole lot of people and a whole lot of agencies knowing about. So you felt a slightly different tenor to that. And I remember things like the fee rule that we did at USCIS at the time, public charge that we were handling at USCIS. How those were done, they might not have been quite the same as they were in earlier years from what people told me. So an increased politicization of some of these things, and then of course you had Biden and all of the things that he wanted to do, and now you have the meetings again more led instead of by career people who you saw during the Obama administration. It was political people who were handling it in Trump one, and again political people who were handling it in Biden.
Mm.
What are we going to do? How are we going to do it? At what pace? Who's going to be in charge? Who's going to be in those meetings? Who's getting direction? And then Trump two, same thing. And so that's I think those are my key points. Is the how it's done at the policy level, how the coordination is done, how the direction is provided, by whom, to whom, and how things are implemented. It's handled in that group, and it's handled in a small group, and it trickles from there to the rest of the bureaucracy, and then it's implemented.
Obviously, you were inside of the machine while that sort of shift was happening that you just described. But you've been in government for a very long time, like you mentioned, and you called it sort of like there was a more regular era before that. Um, from your vantage point, what do you think caused that shift to happen? Did immigration become like a significantly more, not just political issue, but a more important issue at the White House level for both Democrats and Republicans? Sort of
Yes,
around the Trump election, that it
yeah,
forced that sort of change inside of government.
I think it did. I think it did. Not just for Trump, but for Biden, for Obama before him with DACA. Is that uh, yeah, the issues became emotive. They became uh, topics that uh, when you see the surveys that were done, a lot of times economic issues are in the forefront, are going to continue to be in the forefront, but immigration, maybe if you look back a couple of decades, it may have been, number 10 or number 15 on people's on lists, but they started to come up, and it's number two, it's number three, sometimes it's number one, depending on the surveys. It definitely raised the immigration issues. The profile of immigration issues absolutely raised. Maybe you trace it all the way back to 9/11 with as I mentioned, with some of the immigration and security cooperation issues we needed to start to do internationally. Who were these people? Where are they coming from? How do we protect their? How do we build our borders to protect? How could we not have seen that there were these guys who were flying around? Where did
Right.
they come from? Who were they traveling with? What do we know about them? And how do we detect patterns and protect ourselves from that? So yeah, it's definitely increased in the last 20-25 years.
Right. Um, and you mentioned, Stephen Miller, and this is something I wanted to ask you about because one thing that has become more important in sort of that new system of coordination and organization at the top level that you described are the players who are sort of calling the shots and, you know, for lack of a better term, like playing point guard on what these different agencies are using their resources to do. Um, and you served in one of the top leadership roles at USCIS. You were deputy director during the first Trump administration, and you worked very closely with many of the key players who are back in the second Trump administration and who are driving immigration policy at both USCIS and more broadly at DHS. Um, so now in the second Trump administration, this is a topic that I'm always I'm always eager to talk about because I think amongst the immigration practitioner community that listen to this podcast, like they know about Stephen Miller, right? And they maybe like think a little bit about Joseph Edlow, or they might see a clip of him talk about something on News Nation or something like that. Um, but I'm curious from your vantage point as somebody who's worked with these folks, who you think like the real key policy players are in this Trump administration when it comes to immigration, um, and maybe your advice for practitioners on how to think about these individuals' motivations, priorities, um, how they're making decisions, right, in 2026 around immigration policy and like what's most important to them? I know it's a broad question, but you can
Mhm.
sort of take that in any direction you want.
Thank you. Good. It's the I think the best way to address that is to I should give a caveat. Of course, as you said, I worked with these people 5, 6 years ago, and to what extent they are working the same now. I'm sure they've all grown. I'm sure they've all matured. I'm sure they've all learned from Trump 1 as they're back. But my experience was that Stephen Miller was really the driving force behind a lot of what was happening. There were people who had worked for Senator Grassley, for example. They had been doing immigration for years and years. But then you'd be in these meetings with Stephen Miller, and he would say, "Well, I was looking at the INA again over the weekend, and I came across this," and he would just ask these questions. Why do we? And the answer might be from someone around the table. Well, this is the way we've always done it. We've always interpreted the law this way, and not a good, not the right thing to say to Stephen Miller. That if the way it's if that's the way that it's always been done, that's not going to satisfy me, because had you thought about it this way? Had what if we interpreted this? Had you ever thought of it with this different lens? And so that could be challenging sometimes. That could be interesting sometimes. A way that a new way of looking at something. And I think a lot of leaders try to do that. Um, I worked with Joe Edlow, worked with Rob Law, but as I said, it was many years ago. It'd be hard for me to characterize, but I I do think that of course Tom Homan, but also Miller are driving a lot of what is happening. And from their point of view, you look back at the Biden years with millions of people coming into the country, whether it was United for Ukraine or uh, CHNV, and so many other methods, programs. TPS, of course, it was extended and um, uh, what do they call them? Redesignations.
Yeah.
And so they look back at that and say they needed to. They feel like from their perspective, they need to climb out of a deeper hole. It's not as if it's the same when they left office 4 years ago. It's now the problem has gotten a lot worse from their perspective, and so there's a lot more that they felt as though they need to address. Um, they and so I think later on we may have a chance to talk about things like the refugee program, diversity visa. But these are all the things that were on their list of things that they were concerned about, and now you see them uh, tackling them one by one. But those I thought were the key decision makers, and they still are.
Well, yeah, and you raised a good point there because there was certainly a lot that happened during the Biden administration that this Trump administration clearly made it one of their top priorities to just roll all of that back as much as possible and reverse as much of that as possible during 2025. And I was looking at the unified agenda for DHS and USCIS with a former policy analyst at USCIS who used to work for the Office of Policy and Strategy, and we were just sort of perusing it and just looking like, okay, like pretty much every rule is, or every policy manual update has just been like taking out or reversing something that the Biden administration did during their first 4 years. And then on the high skilled side, right, the high skilled pipeline side, during 2025, there were basically only two things that the Trump administration started to do at least. One was implement the weighted lottery, which is coming into play
Mhm.
here in the next month or so.
Yep.
The weighted lottery for H-1Bs, to sort
Yep.
of change that system. Um, it's had some change over the past decade, but this is probably the most significant change since the original lottery was introduced, 20, 25 years ago. Um, and then it's still in sort of the proposed rule stage, and they're going through the public comments now, but ending duration of status
Yep.
for primarily for foreign students on F1 visas. Other than that, like not a ton of policy manual or rule changes when it came to like the high skilled immigration pipeline. And one of the things I'm wondering about in 2026, and maybe you can comment on this as somebody again who was in these meetings, midway through the first Trump administration, once they had maybe already had the chance to roll back everything they didn't like about Obama's policies or the way Obama was running DHS and USCIS. What do you think like their focus might be for the next year or so? Do you think that there's more? There's more to, again from rules and regulations. We can sort of keep deportations out of it, because that opens up a whole conversation that we'd have to have 10 more podcasts about at least. But on just sort of the rulemaking side and just organizationally within USCIS and DHS, do you think like there are clear priorities for them in 2026 based off of what you know about these players, or do you think like for structural changes that they want to make, like new changes they want to make, or do you think it's another year of just let's keep pulling back Biden era policies, reversing that, slowing everything down, and fighting it out in the courts, which they're already doing and they're going to have to do more of?
I think you may have already answered some of your own question. I mean, the unified agenda is there. I
Yeah,
think they've been quite open about what they are concerned about. I think I think it would be wise to expect more of the same, but also more tightening. Um, and so I think they have some flexibility at where they want to go. But if you look at just recent events of the last number of months, um, and you see how unexpected events can have a huge impact. You saw the ICE enforcement action in Georgia, and there are different reports that you could read that, maybe some people knew about it, maybe some people didn't know about it, but in any event, it had a huge impact, and it was raised at very high levels in the Korean government. They raised it with the White House, and now you see, and I saw that they had their third meeting at the end of January, the new joint travel and economic partnership, or whatever they call it, senior working group. They've met in Washington, they've met in Seoul, and it's to address some of these issues. And the word seems to have gone out, hey, before you start raiding a factory, I know that ICE doesn't like or use the term raid in enforcement action, that uh, that is going to have this sort of impact. Maybe some people want to have a heads up about it, because we've had to clearly do some fence mending with our partners and friends in South Korea, and the president has engaged with the leadership there, and investment, and you see the headlines of Korean investment in the United States, and the tariffs that go up, that come down, and so and so that had an impact on what ICE is going to do and where, and what sort of impact. And you go on from there. We had the tragic shooting here in Washington of the National Guard members by allegedly by an Afghan who had come here under one of those programs. And then
right.
overnight, or very rapidly thereafter, we're going to do a complete revet. We're going to take a look at this top to bottom. And of course, there are many voices that might come up and say this is disproportionate, and these were our partners. They fought alongside us. But that was the trigger that caused that. And so that was an unanticipated thing. Was that on their list? Oh, we want to do a crackdown here? Maybe, probably, perhaps. But this was the trigger. And then you take another one, the tragic shooting at Brown University,
Mm.
that was traced to someone who came in through the diversity visa program. Again, was that on their list of to-dos? That sometime in the next 4 years we're going to take a look at this, we're going to revet, we're going to pull it down, we're going to whatever. That was the trigger. And so who knows what will happen later today, this week, next month, this year, but there may be other triggers that'll pull something else front and center. That, okay, it's time to, whether it's a immigration or non-immigrant channel, that, this the time for us to take a fresh look at this one. This one just got bumped to the top of the agenda, and we're going to pull these down. We're going to slow these down. We're going to revet, etc. So that's what I would be. That's what I would be prepared for.
It's an excellent point, and all of those sort of policy updates were happening very quickly as those events in the news were happening, and then the news cycle moves on, and the policy update exists, and sort of practitioners and the folks who are affected, immigrant applicants are left sort of dealing with like what are the consequences of this. But you're right. I mean, it's very clear if you just look at the last 3 or 4 months alone that current leadership at USCIS has been very reactive, I think, to events that are happening in the country, but also sort of taking. Who knows if there's a direct. I mean, you might, right? You might have a sense for this or not. If there's like a direct like policy meeting after one of those events happened, where Stephen Miller and Joseph Edlow and Rob Law and some other folks get into a room and say, okay, here's the new plan, or if it's just the brass of USCIS sees, okay, this happened. What action can we take to support what we believe the administration's priorities would be around this? And yeah, that seems to be driving a lot of the action. How much air do you think that's taking up, though, from other priorities? Because for some of the actions they're taking, and again, we don't know the full breadth of them yet in terms of like pausing, uh, review of applications for tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of applicants from specific countries or with specific designations, or re-reviewing or re-interviewing or things like that, right? Applications that have already been approved. Um, yeah, how much air do you think that takes up? And as somebody who was in a senior leadership role at USCIS and was part of sort of, and I get it was a different era, but like part of helping the agency figure out what its plan was on a month to month, quarter to quarter, year to year basis. Um, do you think that the current leadership at USCIS, if they have 5 priorities that they want to enact in 2026, even think that they'll have the resources and the time to do that, or do you think they're just going to keep sort of going where the wind takes them, for lack of a better term?
So I need to be careful about speculating, but I think
Fair.
you've hit something. I think it does take a lot of air out of the room when these things happen, and there's probably some top down as well as bottom up. That before Director Edlow goes to these meetings, he probably wants to have from his staff, hey, give me 5 things that we could do to tackle this new really unfortunate situation that has arisen that the administration is going to want to do something about. But I think decisions going to be made in those meetings, and Stephen Miller is probably chairing those meetings.
Mm.
So that would be the top down. So would he take the ideas from USCIS, or would he have some of his own that he imposes? It's probably a blend, but I'm sure it takes a lot of when these two that I just cited, uh, with respect to refugees, the diversity visa, that is, and everyone relies on your data then to know just how far how far behind are they getting,
Yeah.
and you're measuring it, and your data shows it from time to time. So that probably is the best way to answer your question.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I mean, it's February 6th as we're recording this, and USCIS is still yet to release their summer case processing data, and we've heard
Well,
that there's been no directive to like stop releasing the data, which I've said it before on the podcast. Like most of the data that USCIS releases, they do so freely; they're not required to. There's a few congressionally mandated data sets that have to be released on a monthly basis. Even those are late now too. So eventually those ones are going to have to come out. But yeah, it's all indications from everyone I've spoken to inside and outside of USCIS is that the staffing is a real problem there, and operational resources are becoming difficult, even if is a robust sort of policy agenda from the top that wants to be implemented. The math is the math, and you need to have
yeah,
the bodies and the minds to actually execute on it. So,
yeah,
um, so sort of speaking of which, one of the more, I mean, you held a lot of very, very interesting roles in your career, but one that I really wanted to focus in on because I think and we've hinted at this already, it's very relevant to what happened in 2025 and what is still happening in 2026 with the Trump administration, is the transition from the Biden administration, excuse me, from the first Trump administration to the Biden administration.
yeah,
And it was where we saw probably one of the most dramatic swings in
yeah.
immigration policy between two administrations in a very long time, at least in my
Up
opinion.
until that point, anyway.
Right. Yeah. Probably like going back to, the know nothings in 1848 or something. I don't know. But
No, no one before that eclipsed it.
right.
2021, but then 2025. That was
Yes.
a big change too.
And that's what many listeners, practitioners who listen to the podcast, just sort of experienced. And you held a very important position, sort of at the helm at DHS in running that transition from Trump to Biden. Could you maybe talk a little bit more about that experience and sort of how a transition looks operationally when it comes from like staffing to,
Yeah.
okay, let's take stock of what's been happening here,
Mhm.
since we haven't been here, to like, hey, here's our direction now, go. Like just walk listeners through that, because I think
Sure.
it's a really fascinating development.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it really was an interesting time for me and an interesting time in my career. So I think we all remember, if we think back, we were waiting for ascertainment, and the GSA administrator has to ascertain that there was a victor. And it wasn't until the Monday before Thanksgiving of 2020 that the GSA administrator said, over the weekend, I think Pennsylvania or one state or another was called finally by the AP,
Yeah.
and then so that night Monday evening, I had my first conversation. My deputy and I had my first conversation with the Biden team, the incoming Biden team. The director for the transition was Urja Du, who
Hmm.
I think, as many of your listeners will know, became the director of USCIS, and Jonathan Meyer, who became the chief counsel of DHS, headquarters. So they were obviously destined to bigger and better things, but at the time they were coordinating that. And I was the only person, my team and I, we were the only people from the Trump administration who were authorized to talk to the Biden team. Now, were people talking with old friends? Were they texting? Were they on LinkedIn? Maybe, probably. But this was uh, that was the official direction, and that came out from the Trump appointees. You are not to talk to the Biden people. One we have one channel to talk to them, and that's through the transition team that I led. And anything else is unauthorized and not allowed. And so I met with them. We had a closeout meeting. I set up over 100 meetings that they wanted, deep dives across the DHS. We had classified meetings in SCIFs, so we're all masked. This is
Right.
the the height of the pandemic, and over 140 data requests that they had. Give us data on this. Give us information on this, and what has changed since 4 years ago during Obama, when many of them might have been in office, or some on their team had been. Daily calls, and we were actually on one of our calls during doing a briefing when we're all getting text alerts saying that the Capitol has been breached. And we did our first phone call on immigration, on the inauguration security ramp up at 9 p.m. that evening of January 6th, and had a series of continuing ones, obviously led by the Secret Service, on what the inauguration would look like. And that team, and Jonathan, the Biden team, they were putting together, so they had kept careful track of all of the executive orders that Trump had done, all the changes they had made, and uh, they were ready on day one. And President Biden signed a number of things, and then you saw it. You saw the prohibition on wall construction. You saw the pulling down of the public charge rule, the pulling down, cancellation of Remain in Mexico, the travel ban, on and on. All those changes were day one, or certainly first couple of days. The 100-day pause on deportations. That
Hmm.
was all what they were pulling together. And they had gotten briefs. And there were people in the room, and I heard about this afterwards. So some of this is, a little bit of the armchair quarterback, and it took place in the weeks and months after. But they would get briefings from CBP. The CBP would say, if you do this, and we see what candidate Biden and now President-elect Biden said he wants to do on day one. If you do this, you're gonna have your hands full. There's gonna be a lot of people coming to the border.
Yeah.
And they told me afterwards then all of the career people would leave the room, and they told me afterwards that they were huddling. Was that a bunch of BS that we were getting? Was that a bunch of Trump talk that we were hearing, or were we really good?
Hmm.
And there were some people in the room of the Biden people saying, no, I think we may have a crisis on our hands. We may have a real border surge. And there are others who said, no, no, don't exaggerate. Don't believe them. We'll be able to handle it. And now we know the facts. Of course, there was quite a large number of people who came, and they did have their hands full. Um, and then President Biden adjusted his policies as he went. And interesting, but I think it's the mirror image during the Biden years. You had the Stephen Millers and the others that we were talking about, and the roles are now reversed. So they're in the NGOs, and they're in America First Legal, or they're at Center for American Prosperity, and they are putting together their lists of, if and when we're back in office, what are we going to want to do on day one? Uh, Maybe EOs, executive orders get drafted. Maybe they're getting ready to implement. And I think you saw on day one of Trump too, that what they had written and what they had been briefed during the transition period, they were ready to go on day one. And we saw it again. The CBP1 app, CHNV, all pulled down day one. And 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 I would presume that the same thing is happening now.
Yeah.
Somewhere here in this city, there are people putting their heads together, making that list. What has Trump done? If we're back in office, what are we going to want to do on day one, week one, month one? Um, are there things that they might want to modify? Uh, Might there be a couple of things they want to keep? But the majority, what are they going to want to turn off?
It's an incredibly fascinating story to hear you talk about it from sort of being in the room and you know, being there as all of this was happening. And it is anchored in what you were talking about at the beginning of the podcast, which is sort of the shift that happens, 10, 15 years ago, at the end of the Obama administration, and then going into the first Trump administration, where like the sort of uh, normal, rules of the road, normal standard operating procedures were just changed, and it seems like that's accelerating, right, a
Yeah,
little bit. And obviously, we've had, the Trump administration for 4 years, the Biden administration for 4 years, second Trump administration now. And I'm not going to ask you to speculate on, 2028 politics by any means. But what I am curious to ask you, because I think that a lot of practitioners who listen to this podcast are already thinking about this down the line, like, especially for sort of their businesses and how they advise their clients in the long term, because a lot of these, a lot of their clients who are making decisions now on their immigration journey, what the landscape looks like 3 years from now is going to be relevant to the decision that they make now, given how long some of these application processing times are taking at this point. Um, that's really important for them and their families, and then it's really important for practitioners who are like operating a immigration law firm, a business, and they're trying to figure out like what we sort of where the winds are blowing. So maybe you could give your sense on like to the sort of the two separate scenarios here. One, if there is a continuation of whoever succeeds Trump, right, in 2028, and it's a Republican administration, let's say immigration policy, it's fairly aligned with the current Trump administration. Um, what does that sort of what does that cleaner transition maybe look like in terms of an additional 4 years for this policy agenda to have to push forward within the executive branch, versus, and I think this you sort of already gave this, so it's a bit of a shorter answer, versus if the pendulum swings back the other direction and a Democrat comes into office and a lot of the folks who were maybe in the Biden administration come back and we see a repeat of what we saw in 21 and what we saw in 25, which was just first year is all reversing. So maybe focus on that first one. Like, what do you think? How much more leverage does an additional continuous 4 years of an administration have in terms of affecting policy change, immigration policy change?
so I'll take them one at a time. I think that if we had and I should say at the outset though, this is all such speculation.
Sure.
We're many months out from the midterm, and who knows what may happen then and how that'll affect things. But if you go even further out to 2028, it's really impossible to know. You can imagine two different scenarios: Democrat wins, Republican wins.
Sure.
And I do think that if we do have a Republican in the White House for another 4 years, I would put my focus on. I talked about the Georgia situation and the Korean battery factory down there. You see the different influences, the different centers of gravity at play there. The pro-business, pro-investment, pro-trade part of the Republican base that says, we need to partner with these countries, and we want their skilled people to come to be able to help their investments. We want trade to increase. We want partnership with these countries. And then you see some of that the other side that is the more um, let's focus on American jobs. Maybe have some folks come here for a couple of weeks, give training, but then we want American jobs in
Right.
American factories, for American companies. Um, and so you saw that tension. So I think that's one example. You can imagine others, whether it's universities or other employers. Um, but if it's a Democratic administration, then yeah, and be more of that pendulum swing and some of these things getting overturned. But I think uh, one additional angle that we talked about that might well be on their agenda. And you hear that term, chain migration, siblings of American citizens, and instead of just the children, parents, children, uh, might that be? I wouldn't put I wouldn't say that that's safe forever under the under the leadership of the people who have, expressed the views that they have with respect to that sort of thing. So that would be my concern if it's where I would, if I were an immigration attorney and was advising clients, what are the things that I would be concerned about in what scenario?
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I appreciate you playing along with that question again. As I know it's super speculative, but I think it's your response was will be helpful and insightful for the folks who are listening. I want to pivot. Go
One
ahead.
additional thing that I might
Yeah.
add, and here we are this week where they're talking about we faced, I guess, in 1 week the money runs out in the continuing resolution for DHS, the main funding stream, putting aside what they got under the one big beautiful bill. But if you look at some of the comments that have come and the statements from Democratic leaders, they are saying we need to have a secure border. You don't see anyone saying, and so some things may change, but as I said, some things they might want to do a complete 180, and that's understood. And I think we talk about what some of those might be. But other things, they may, sometimes the center of gravity shifts, and I sort of feel like the center of gravity is shifting with that.
Oh, for sure. I think, yeah, I 100% agree with you. It's interesting to see it on the high skilled immigration front too, because there's a lot of passion, on the right side of the aisle right now that sort of bottom up about the H-1B program and either strictly limiting it or entirely eliminating the H-1B
Eliminate, yeah,
program.
yeah.
And
I've seen those voices.
there's really not much fervor about anything related to like sort of the high skilled immigration pathways on the left. I think for the most part, it's not, other than the folks who have actually served inside of the executive branch in that area, in the Biden administration, the Obama administration. There's really not much like knowledge about it on the Hill. I think it's fair to say it's just like not something that folks are concerned about, other than maybe you know university access to being able to bring in foreign students because of the economics of that. Um, but that's one that I'm watching closely because like historically, and you know this, like historically the left was more sort of anti the H-1B program, right? For labor reasons, and that's shifted, but I don't think like if a Democratic administration comes into office in 2028, we have a clear picture of what the if there's a consensus position on that, or if the left has like their own theory of the case when it comes to how many high skilled immigration pathways we should have, what the cap should be on those, what the process should be, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one that I'm sort of keeping an eye on over the next couple of years. I don't know if a conversation around it will develop. I tend to doubt it, but you never know. Everything's sort of driven by the news cycle, as we talked about before too.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I would say I have seen some of the voices, whether it's the university community, as you
yeah,
mentioned, but also some employers and some who are concerned about how those who are in the shadows are being exploited, or they are treated as a 1099 and not a W-2 employee, and having people. So I do think that employer groups, union groups are making their voices known, but you're right. I think you might be seeing louder concerns from the right side of the perspective. The tech companies, of course, that have also they've been vocal. A lot of voices speaking on that, on the future there, and the $100,000 fee and the lottery. It's been front and center.
yeah. Yeah. I wanted to pivot a little bit
Yeah,
because you spent a good chunk of your career um, at CBP, and we don't talk a lot about CBP on this podcast. We tend to focus on USCIS, just given the sort of the listenership. But CBP is it's a massive agency, obviously, as you've told me about in more detail than I sort of knew before from the outside, and it covers a lot of areas. It sort of has a lot under its portfolio, but immigration is a part of it, right? And one of the things that we discussed when we met before we started recording this podcast was sort of the gap that I've noticed from the outside on CBP's sort of like tech development as an organization over the last decade versus USCIS, which seems a lot slower. And I was, curious to sort of let you share your thoughts on why that gap exists and like what you think some of the drivers are of that, and maybe how USCIS might be able to catch up a little bit to CBP in the future. So I'll leave that one open ended for you to talk a little bit about as well.
Well, thanks. It is a shift in gears from what we were talking about before, and I would say that the biggest for me is a different mindset. The mindset at CBP is this is a no-fail 24/7 mission. There will be more people coming tomorrow, trains, boats, trucks, everything is coming towards that border, and CBP has to handle it. And then you have new threats that emerge. Tunnels. Now we got to start detecting tunnels better. Now we got drones. The cartels are flying drones across the border with drugs. We have ultralights that occasionally fly across the border. Biographics and biometrics have to be used, going all the way back to 9/11 to be able to make the decisions, have the best to use the best data that CBP has, but also that other agencies have, that the FBI has, that the intelligence community has, that we maybe have gotten off the battlefield. Fingerprints that were pulled off of an IED in Iraq. If we come across that fingerprint, because whenever something happens, everyone says, what did we know and when did we know it and why didn't we prevent it? And if you go back to the time when I was at DHS, you had things like the underwear bomber and the shoe bomber. And so now we need to push these things even further. We need to push all this information to the airlines. So we tell those, because we can't wait for them to be in secondary at JFK or LAX. We need to tell these airlines, pull that guy aside before he's put on the plane and, look at his shoes, open up his suitcase, go through everything, look at his laptop, make sure there's no semtext in his laptop, on and on. And so the focus has been do everything. We cannot allow another event, another terrorist attack to happen. And, knock on wood, there's been a certain amount of success there, and there've been a lot of resources that have been provided to CBP because the nation doesn't want such a thing to happen again. And then if you look at the immigration side of that, at the land border, CBP has to deal with whoever arrives. If there are 3,000 Haitians that arrive in Del Rio one day, CBP's got to deal with them. And ICE can say, oh, sorry, we're full up. And HHS could say, oh, sorry, we can't take any more children. We know you're supposed to give us the unaccompanied children. We can't take them. We're full up. USCIS can say, oh, sorry, no. But CBP has to take them because they've come. They're here. CBP has to deal with it. And so that mindset prevails at CBP. It's a no-fail mission. And that I saw was, at the time when I was at USCIS, was a little bit different. Because if the backlog is 217 days or 219 days or 215 days, well, I mean, you go home, you come in tomorrow, the backlog's still going to be there. It might be a little bit longer. We'll try to be faster. We want to chip away at it. A year from now, we want it to be a little better than it is today. That's a different mindset from this sort of living the reality, living a crisis or a near crisis every day. You have to deal with it. So, I mean, I can give you an example. So, biometric exit. The Congress, it was one of the 9/11 Commission recommendations. We need to do biometric entry as well as exit. And at the time when people first looked at this, and when it was at DHS headquarters, people were like, how can we possibly? A guy shows up, a person shows up and says, you have their face. How do we verify that? And you can, because it's one to many. And from an IT perspective, the one to many, here's one face. I need to compare that to the billion faces I have in my data bank. How am I going to, that's a level of computing power that we can't do. And you have to do that at 50 or 60 gates at 50 or 60 airports all at the same time. So, but then when it was given to CBP said, let us try that. Let us see if we can work this. You know what CBP did? Is they said, Delta, United, American, you know who's on those planes. You have those reservations. We're going to take a look at that. And then we're going to ask the computer, hey, what faces do you have with these 300 people on this plane? Because if they're American citizens, the State Department has those faces. They got the American passports. If they have a visa, or a green card, we have those faces from USCIS. We have those faces from their visa applications. We have that from the State Department. So it turns out that 99% or so of the time, we already had those faces attached to that name. So when they show up at the gate, that's all it's doing. This is the name. This is the face that we're expecting to go with that name, with that document. Does everything match? Or is something off here? The face is not right. The name is not right. The birth date, the document, something. Can it be explained? Or, when you need to talk with someone. So that's a different, but that was CBP taking a look at that and saying, this is an unworkable problem. But if we shrink the size of this haystack, we can figure this out. And they did it. And there's no question that having the data, being able to harness the data, analyze the data, look for patterns in the data, that has been the secret for CBP for years. You go back to, we were talking about 9/11, and I think we all remember some of that was, they were paying in cash. Oh, they had one-way tickets. These are some of the stereotypes from 20 years ago. That was
Right.
the easy. But then, well, who are they traveling with? Oh, what about that credit card, that phone number, that address? What do we know about that address? Other people who were going to that address were up to no good. Now he says he's going, this is a package that FedEx is sending. Maybe we need to take a look at that package. There's a million packages that come into the country every day, but this one is going to that address. I want to take a look at that package. You harnessing the data to figure out what you need to look at. And then I remember in the era of the foreign fighters who were going to Iraq, going to Syria, that the families would go on vacation to Istanbul, a family from wherever in the US. And they come back, but the teenage boy isn't with them. The teenage boy comes back a week later, a month later. What was he doing? Where did he go? Who was he with? So then these are all things that were then put into the computer. Hey, when people are coming back separately, and there's someone that fits that profile or that fits the pattern of people who have joined terrorist groups, have gotten training. We need to take a look at these people, because you can't open every suitcase. You can't send everyone to secondary. How do we focus attention? So that is something that CBP has gotten very good at. So the fact that USCIS is still, and I was looking at the website just to see, what's the latest? What if they move to electronic? There's still a lot that they do on paper. And when you do it on paper, it's obviously slower, and it all has to be scanned in. And you don't have that ready ability to look for patterns. Does this fit a fraud profile? Have we seen problematic things before? Are we concerned about that address, about that company, about this pattern, about that salary level at the city, or whatever the case may be? If it's not electronic, it's so much harder to do. But then on the other hand, when you have to, and I remember we were doing this when I was there, you take this form, and if you can put a piece of paper in front of someone, they fill it out. And it's, you have the instructions. But if you do it electronically, do you do a pull down menu? Do you make it a required thing? Can they leave it blank? Or do we have this as an open field? And so we need to have it now. We need to have a text analyst that looks to see what sort of text are we looking for if we leave it as an open. Is it a mandatory field? Are there? You have to go field by field through the whole document. It takes an enormous amount of work, but it is worth it. It all should be electronic, and maybe in a couple of years we'll do this podcast again, and we'll marvel at how USCIS has turned everything electronic. But
I don't know if we'll marvel. We might marvel might be a little bit too much. They might make it to 2008. I think a lot of people would be happy with that if they made it to 2008 levels.
That's what they need to do.
Yeah.
I think everyone's aware of that.
It's a really, really fascinating perspective, and it makes a lot of sense that the national security mission of CBP and the size and scope of its mission sort of forces, right? Like necessity is the mother of invention, right? It sort of forces them to adapt more quickly. How much do you think the funding mechanisms sort of play into it as well, right? You referenced it a little bit at the beginning. I mean, USCIS is obviously fee funded by individuals, immigrants who are submitting applications and have to pay the government fees. 97% of whatever of their of their operating budget comes from those fees, whereas CBP, totally different funding, right? It's part of broader DHS. How much do you think that comes into play in terms of how those two agencies, how quickly they're able to move on things, for example, and move on improvements?
I think it's certainly a factor. There are some of the years that I was a CBP, money was tight. Some of the time, the money. I mean, you never have. no bureaucrat in Washington will say, "Oh, I have too much money, and then I know what to do with it." Everyone always has priorities, always wants to improve the mission, no matter what agency you work in, and you never have enough. You don't have enough people to do what you believe needs to be done. But no question, CBP has gotten some serious resources, particularly in the last year, and a lot of the things on the to-do list have been able to be addressed. But some of the things that we've been talking about, whether it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, those may have been some pretty leaner times, and they had to reprioritize. And there were some things that couldn't be done, and some things that get pushed to the right, and airframes that have to get and boats and vehicles that the Border Patrol drives are notoriously getting a little bit old. And so I think that the bill, the one big beautiful bill, that there's a lot of money to replace some of these 10-year-old vehicles that some of them are driving, because the focus had been on some of the things that absolutely had to get done.
Yeah.
And no question that probably constrains USCIS, although, as you said, they are now in a better financial. I mean, boy, the pandemic hit them hard, but now they're in a far better position to be able to tackle some of these things.
Yeah.
And that's an ongoing conversation with the Congress. And as we saw during the Biden administration, USCIS was able to get an infusion to do some things. So, and there's that balance. What should be user paid for, or that cost shifting, because some of the services they provide, some of the processing they do, they don't get a lot of money for, and vice versa.
I have a half-baked idea that I've shared on the podcast before, and this could sort of segue into our last segment where I ask you for your half-baked idea. But I've always thought, President Trump has rolled out this gold card, right, which he sees as being very advantageous for the country. I think one of the most sneaky, effective bureaucratic solutions you could have to modernize USCIS is give out 100, 1,000, however many automatic green cards. You get to jump the line if you participate in this task force as an immigrant, as a top software developer immigrant who comes in and modernizes our entire system, gets everything electronic. I think you could if you got the 100 or 1,000 of the top software developers who are coming over here on H-1Bs or O's or L's or whatever it is, to participate in that, you could have it done really, really quickly. And
I'm on board.
Let them jump the line. So
I'm on board. Let's do it.
We'll see. We'll see if maybe I can sneak that one in. Maybe I'll recommend it to USCIS at their next. They don't do that many stakeholder meetings anymore, but maybe they'll bring those back. Mark, so with that's my half-baked idea. Somebody who, other than interning at the State Department, my senior year of college, has not worked inside of government. So listeners should take it with a heavy grain of salt, but you had a very long, multi-decade career inside of the State Department, inside of DHS, working on many issues, but immigration was one that was something that you were closely involved in. So I wanted to ask you for your sort of half-baked idea. If tomorrow Stephen Miller or President Trump called you up on the phone and said, "Hey, Mark, we want to make you immigration czar for a week, and we want to give you carte blanche to just make this system better, just improve how inefficient it is for regardless of political policies, right? Just make the government act more efficiently." What would be some of the things that you would focus on if you were granted that mysterious power?
Yeah, I don't know if it's a blessing or a curse, but so the two things, and I don't know if they're as achievable as yours. Yours might be more achievable than mine. But the two things that come to mind, one is for a way for the systems to all interact a little bit better. Because you come in, you've got a visa from the State Department, you get processed by CBP, and then maybe you're a student, you're in CVIS. So I said, do those systems, do they all need to be separate? Could there be a way for it all to be one unified system, so that when you're later getting or in line for an H or an L or whatever, maybe a green card at some point, it's all there. All the data is there. We can get rid of some of that redundancy, and the information can be shared and trusted across the agency. So that would be one. But I think the one that I would really, if I were truly in charge for a day, and you'd have to be even more powerful than some of the people that you mentioned.
Sure.
But we talked about the pendulum swings. I think the pendulum swings are so wasteful. We haven't talked about the waste that it creates. And I think some of the people who might be listening to this podcast and the people that you talk to, Finn, they know the impact on their clients. They know the real world family impact, families who are divided or who are at a loss as to what channel to follow um, as things change. But having seen it inside the government, it's the wasted resources. We do it one way. We set up a system that does something one way, and then a few years later, we got to turn it completely off. And and the contractors who set up that system, they're laughing all the way to the bank because we got to pay them for the extra year that was on that contract, but now we need to do something completely different. And so the human cost, it's a waste of taxpayer resources. And sometimes within CBP, we hire people to do a particular effort. A whole lot of what we call the Border Patrol processing coordinators were hired to be able to process people so that the border, during the Biden administration, so that they could process people, and the Border Patrol agents who were the real sort of law enforcement could go back and secure the border. What are they doing now? We don't need them anymore. There were
Yeah.
thousands of them were hired. It is so wasteful with the pendulum swing. So if I could be in charge for a day, I would say, there can be some consensus here. Might it be possible for the House and the Senate, the left and the right, to get together and say, what does responsible, reasonable age reform look like?
Mhm.
What is a responsible and reasonable, fair way to deal with DACA? What is it? Other things that we could imagine? Um, might that happen? I mean, it seems far fetched in this polarized era, but I don't completely give up hope. And if some courageous voices were to raise uh, on Capitol Hill, um, then I hope you'll join me in supporting them. Should that day come, we'll be in touch. But because I really think it is the human cost, the IT cost, the human resource cost, the cost of the taxpayer, the resource cost. It's just too much to have these swings. We talked about the swings that from Trump 1, Biden, Trump 2, and it takes a lot out of the workforce. It's such an inefficient way and an unfair way, I think, for the government to operate when the laws are decades old and it
Yeah.
can be interpreted one way by one administration and a completely 180-degree opposite way by a different administration. I think asylum could be strengthened statutorily. Anyway, so that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, it always comes back to, if we had a competent and effective Congress, we could, do all sorts of important things and solve a lot of these problems. A little bonus question for you, just because I'm curious, as somebody again who was in government when this existed, and then when the dissolution happened, and sort of the agencies that came after it. But the old Immigration and Naturalization Service that was split
Yeah.
up into ICBP and USCIS, in retrospect, like 23 years later, do you think that was a good thing, or do you think that the do you think the benefits of doing that have outweighed some of the additional complexities that have been created and inefficiencies that have been created, or do you think it's the other way around, that it was the right thing to do because the benefits of having these three distinct agencies was has ultimately been better?
Having worked inside, I think it's better the way it is. And I take you back to when I went to my first consular tour in Europe in 1991. Okay, I'm really dating myself here, but 34 years working for Uncle Sam. And, so that's when I started. And I did some consultations beforehand, and I went to JFK, and I went to it's called isn't it the Javits Center in Manhattan?
Oh yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
and I'm talking with these people, and I was just like, wait, let me get this straight. So I'm going to be doing the visas. I work for the State Department. You work for, and how do I get stuff to you? And how do you get stuff to me? And then if I send someone, and then if I give someone a visa, then they go. Now I'm having my consultations at JFK, and then you got U.S. Customs, and they work for Treasury, and then we've got INS over here. So you're looking at the passports, and you're looking at the suitcases, and how do the two of you talk to each other? And then I'm issuing the visa, and I work for a third department.
Yeah.
And I was just like, this is nuts the way this works. And so I it's obviously a huge tragedy that it took something like 9/11. to make it happen. But I do think that it did bring better order to the immigration challenge and responsibility that the nation has to handle these laws and to process people, to offer pathways to people. Both of my parents were immigrants. I believe that we should continue to welcome immigrants who benefit this country. Um, so I do think it was the right decision to make. Can there be improvements? Sure. And I think that the Congress can take a look at that if they want. But I do think there's a value in um, having created having a border agency in CBP, having a largely a service providing and adjudicating function in USCIS, and largely an enforcement and investigation function.
Well, very well said, Mark. And you've shared a lot of insight in this hour long or so conversation, and I'm really grateful to you for doing so. And I think our listeners will be as well. Any final words, any final thoughts, Mark, that you want to share before we wrap it up, and then tell folks who are listening if maybe they're interested in talking with you or working with you, what the best way to get in touch with you is.
Thank you. And I think I'd say in closing is thank you for the opportunity. It's been a pleasure working with you in previous months and speaking with you today, going into some greater detail. Very much welcome people who want to reach out to me if there's further questions I can answer for them, or other experiences I can describe, or other lessons that I've learned. And I think when you post this podcast, you can have my contact information there.
Yep.
You've got my email address, and we'll put it out there. If folks want to reach out to me, more than happy to hear from you.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Mark, and we'll have to do this again at some time soon.
All right. Thanks, Finn.